Survival horror is a genre that has seen many forms and flavors. Some games like to take it in an artistic direction, some blend it with action like many of the Resident Evil games, and some try to do their own thing and see how the market reacts. Parasite Eve is without a doubt one of the best examples of a developer throwing things at the survival horror wall to see what sticks. The original game had the player manage aspects of their armor and weapons in a way more similar to the JRPGs of the time, while keeping it generally within the basic gameplay structure of the original Resident Evil games. The gameplay loop of scavenging around for keys and ammo throughout the pre-rendered levels was a proven one by the late 90s, and Square wanted to get in on it. Not every game that mimicked that style worked out though, so to avoid being the next Overblood, Parasite Eve needed to stand out with its own distinct twist on the formula, and that it did. Parasite Eve would release in 1998 to a promptly favorable reception among survival horror fans who appreciated the artwork, the unique vision, and the RPG elements that made it stand out. So why haven't we gotten a new one in so long? What the hell happened to Parasite Eve? As mentioned, the first Parasite Eve game was received fairly well, getting mostly 7s and 8s across the board. It's an interesting mix of elements from different genres, top-notch CGI sequences, and a story that stood out with its heavy emphasis on science and biology, and it turned out great. While it didn't quite topple Resident Evil or Silent Hill as a horror game, it did have an interesting edge over those games with its cross-appeal with RPG fans. Being inspired by a relatively popular Japanese thriller novel also didn't hurt, since the brand already had a built-in fan base in that region. So sales were pretty good for the game, and it went on to be one of PlayStation's more talked about hidden gems or underground hits. The game wasn't without its problems, of course, and many players were a little off-put by the lack of voice dialogue in an era where fully voiced adventure games were becoming more standard, and the game's lack of a map, so naturally Parasite Eve did have its detractors. All in all though, those who stuck with it all the way through generally had a good opinion about it and wanted to see more, despite also maybe feeling a little bit like they had just played through an advanced biology class disguised as a horror game. The sequel would also prove to be an interesting experience, albeit for different reasons. While the first Parasite Eve was a horror RPG with a slight emphasis on action, Parasite Eve 2 was more of an action RPG with a slight emphasis on horror. It also seemed to get a few other areas a little bit mixed up by introducing a targeting system that was dodgy at best, and a game structure that forced the player to focus more on gaining experience by wiping out repetitive rooms filled with enemies than actually getting involved in a good story. The same character from the first is the center of the story again, and even though Aya was as pleasant to look at as ever, she wasn't as easy to control, with an inferior button layout and totally different feel despite it largely being developed by the same team who worked on the first one. However, some designers did quit about halfway through development, so it's possible that that created some sort of ripple effect that manifested in a way that made the sequel feel like a downgrade in a few ways. That being said, overall the game wasn't reviewed too poorly by gaming outlets at the time. Lots of middling scores were given, saving the game from earning a reputation as a failed sequel right out of the gate. It also has its own fan base, with lots of fans who swear it's the best one. It would sell poorly though, so that reputation of being a bad game would eventually find its way to the game in many circles. Generally speaking, it underperformed in basically every way and ultimately divided the still emerging fan base, earning the Parasite Eve franchise a back seat to other horror franchises like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, and even Clock Tower, which would all go on to have more success in their own ways. Dividing the Parasite Eve fan base even more would be the third birthday. The game would take yet another diversion into yet another mix of genres, and what's even worse, the game would be relegated to the PSP, a platform that Sony often used to house franchises that they thought had potential but perhaps were showing signs of fizzling out. On top of being a new platform, having yet another gameplay and art style, the third birthday would drop the Parasite Eve name altogether and ultimately wouldn't even resemble the previous two games outside of having the same characters and very loosely existing in the same universe. Despite everything working against the game, the third birthday was actually a pretty decent third-person shooter adventure game, and perhaps had the most coherent gameplay in the entire series. It also had a more than ample amount of fan service, which was certainly out of step with the tone of the rest of the game, but at this point, Square Enix probably didn't think it could hurt. And aside from some of the typical wonky controls that most 3D games on the PSP had, it played fairly well. Unfortunately, much like Parasite Eve 2, the third birthday did not meet sales expectations, and ended up sealing the fate of the franchise for the foreseeable future. The fall of Parasite Eve seemed just as swift as its rise, with the entire lifespan of the franchise taking place within about a 10-year period, just as it was starting to gain a retro cult following to add to its original fanbase. The third game in the series was jumbling the story into such a mess that nobody knew what to think of it anymore. I imagine it was even more confounding for developers, as the correct direction to take with the series for a fourth game was probably impossible to determine at that point. Do you make a fourth game in the series and attempt to make sense out of all the contradictions up to that point? Do you just continue with the trajectory and the style of the third birthday? Do you go back to basics and bring things back to their roots of blending survival horror and RPG mechanics? Our guess is probably as good as theirs at this point. All three games have their good points, their drawbacks, and their own compartmentalized fan bases. The disjointed nature of the series is similar to Dino Crisis in that each game tried something new but drove a wedge into their fan base each time, thereby leaving the franchise with too few fans of any one game to justify another one. The one glimmer of hope that Parasite Eve fans should rejoice in is that many survival horror fans are showing interest in older titles like never before, and with the rights to Parasite Eve still in the hands of Square Enix, perhaps the series still has a few more tricks left up its sleeve. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed and would like to see more, feel free to hit that subscribe button and hit the notification bell to ensure you'll be notified when new videos go up.